At Sunday brunch, they announced that Grandpa's inheritance would pay off my sister's $120,000 debt. My aunt smirked. "You never really needed your share." I just sipped my coffee and checked my phone. The trust I'd quietly opened 3 months ago had just finalized, and the money wasn't where they thought it was. I, 32M, sat at the mahogany dining table in my parents' house, watching the Sunday brunch unfold like a carefully orchestrated performance. The scent of fresh coffee mixed with bacon grease filled the air as my family gathered around, their voices creating that familiar background hum of weekend conversation. My sister sat across from me, dark circles under her eyes betraying the stress she'd been carrying for months. The credit card debt had been eating at her since her divorce went through, and everyone knew about the financial mess she'd inherited from her ex-husband's failed business ventures. Mom had been making worried comments about it for weeks, and Dad kept suggesting she talk to a financial advisor. My aunt cleared her throat and stood up, her wine glass catching the morning light streaming through the bay windows. She had that look on her face that meant she was about to make one of her grand announcements, the kind that usually left someone feeling smaller than they'd started. She began explaining how they'd all been talking, how the family had come together to make a decision about Grandpa's estate. The words flowed out of her mouth with practiced precision, describing how my sister's situation was dire, how family needed to help family, how Grandpa would have wanted his money to solve real problems for people who really needed it. My sister's eyes started welling up as my aunt continued, explaining that they decided to allocate Grandpa's inheritance specifically toward paying off the debt. The relief on my sister's face was immediate and overwhelming. She started thanking everyone, her voice breaking as she talked about how this would change everything for her and her kids. Then my aunt turned to me with that smirk I'd seen 1,000 times growing up. She told me that since I had a good job and no major financial obligations, since I'd always been the responsible one who saved money and made smart choices, I never really needed my share anyway. The words hung in the air like smoke, and I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting for my reaction. I took a slow sip of my coffee and pulled out my phone, scrolling through my notifications with deliberate calm. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. 3 months ago, when I'd first heard whispers about family meetings I wasn't invited to, I'd made some calls of my own. The email notification I'd been waiting for was sitting right there in my inbox. I opened it, reading the confirmation that made my chest tight with a mixture of satisfaction and disbelief. The trust I'd quietly established had just finalized, and every penny of Grandpa's money that was supposed to be mine had been legally transferred exactly where I'd directed it. My cousin asked if I was okay, noting how quiet I'd become. I told him I was just checking something important, that sometimes timing was everything in life. My aunt repeated her earlier statement about how I didn't need the money, adding that it was generous of the family to make sure it went where it could do the most good. I stood up from the table and walked over to the window, looking out at the garden where Grandpa used to spend his mornings. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were making decisions about his money in the same house where he'd taught me about personal responsibility and financial independence. When I turned back to the table, I told them there was something they needed to know. The conversation stopped, and my sister looked up with concern, probably thinking I was going to cause problems about their generous solution to her debt crisis. I explained that I'd been thinking about Grandpa's inheritance for months, ever since I learned about the family discussions happening without me. I told them how I'd realized that if they felt comfortable making decisions about my portion without consulting me, then maybe I should make some decisions of my own. My aunt's expression shifted from smugness to confusion as I continued. I described how I'd contacted Grandpa's estate attorney, how I'd learned about the legal options available to me as a beneficiary, how I'd discovered that the money hadn't actually been distributed yet despite what everyone seemed to believe. The truth was, I'd established a trust 3 months ago and had my portion of the inheritance transferred directly into it. The money they were planning to use to pay off my sister's debt was sitting in an account that only I controlled, designated for a purpose none of them had bothered to ask me about. My sister's face went pale as the implications started sinking in. She asked what I meant, her voice barely above a whisper. My parents looked confused, and my aunt's smirk had completely disappeared. I told them about the scholarship fund I'd created in Grandpa's name. The money they thought they were redistributing was already committed to helping kids from our old neighborhood attend college. The paperwork had been filed, the legal structures were in place, and the first scholarships would be awarded next spring. The silence that followed was deafening. My aunt started sputtering about how I couldn't just take money that the family needed, how my sister's situation was an emergency, how I was being selfish and irresponsible. I reminded her that she'd just finished explaining how I didn't need the money, how it was better used for people who had real problems. I told her that seemed like exactly what I'd done, found people who really needed help and made sure they got it. My sister started crying, but not the relieved tears from earlier. These were the desperate tears of someone watching a lifeline disappear. She asked if there was any way to change it, if the trust could be dissolved, if we could work something out as a family. I explained that the legal documents had been signed and filed. The money was committed, and frankly, I thought Grandpa would approve. He'd always believed in education, always talked about giving people opportunities to better themselves. The scholarship fund would help dozens of kids over the years, kids who might not otherwise have the chance to go to college. My aunt's voice got sharp as she demanded to know how I could do this to family. She said I was destroying my sister's chance at a fresh start, that I was being vindictive and cruel. She accused me of planning this whole thing out of spite. I told her she was partially right. I had planned it, but not out of spite. I'd planned it because I'd learned that my family was comfortable making major financial decisions without including me in the conversation. If they could decide I didn't need my inheritance, then I could decide how to use it before they got the chance. My father finally spoke up, asking why I hadn't said anything earlier. He wanted to know why I'd let them make plans, why I'd sat through the whole announcement without stopping them. I explained that I'd wanted to see how far they'd go. I'd been curious about whether anyone would think to ask my opinion about my own inheritance. I'd wondered if anyone would consider that maybe I had plans for that money, goals and dreams that mattered just as much as my sister's debt. The answer had been no. They'd assumed that because I lived modestly and saved money, because I didn't have obvious financial problems, my share was essentially spare change that could be redirected without consequence. My mother asked about my sister's situation, pointing out that the debt was real and serious. She wanted to know how we could solve that problem now that the inheritance wasn't available. I suggested they could do what any other family would do, help within their means, explore loan options, maybe set up a payment plan. I pointed out that my sister's financial crisis wasn't actually my responsibility to solve, especially when I'd never been asked if I wanted to help. The conversation became heated as my aunt continued arguing about family obligations and loyalty. She insisted that I was destroying relationships over money, that Grandpa wouldn't have wanted his inheritance to cause this kind of division. I disagreed. I told her that Grandpa had always been clear about personal responsibility and making your own way in the world. He'd also been passionate about education and opportunity. The scholarship fund honored both of those values while helping people who had no other options. My sister asked if I hated her, if this was punishment for her divorce and financial mistakes. Her voice was small and broken, and for a moment I felt the weight of what my decision meant for her immediate situation. I told her I didn't hate her, that this wasn't about punishment. It was about the fact that for months, my family had been meeting and planning and deciding what to do with my money without ever thinking to include me. It was about the assumption that my needs and wants were less important than everyone else's. She wanted to know if there was any way to work together, any compromise that could help her situation while still honoring my wishes. She suggested maybe using part of the money for her debt and part for the scholarship fund. I explained that the legal commitments had already been made. The money was in the trust, designated specifically for educational scholarships. Even if I wanted to change it now, which I didn't, the paperwork had been filed and processed. My aunt made one final attempt, appealing to my sense of family duty. She painted a picture of my sister losing her house, of her kids having to change schools, of a family member suffering while I funded scholarships for strangers. I reminded her of her own words from earlier in the conversation. She'd said I never really needed my share, that the money was better used for people with real problems. I'd simply taken that advice and applied it more broadly, finding people whose problems were even more significant than my sister's debt. The irony was perfect, and everyone at the table knew it. They'd made their assumptions about my financial situation and my priorities, and I'd used those assumptions to make my own decisions about what mattered most. As the argument continued, I realized that this moment had been building for years. Every family gathering where my successes were downplayed, every time my careful financial planning was dismissed as being lucky or privileged, every assumption that I could absorb costs or sacrifices because I was doing fine. It had all led to this Sunday brunch where my family felt comfortable redistributing my inheritance without consultation. The scholarship fund wasn't just about helping students or honoring Grandpa's memory. It was about drawing a line, about saying that being financially responsible didn't mean being financially invisible. It was about making sure that my values and priorities mattered just as much as everyone else's drama and crisis. Update 1. The following week brought a series of phone calls and text messages that ranged from pleading to accusatory. My sister tried multiple approaches, starting with emotional appeals about her children's stability and escalating to accusations that I was deliberately sabotaging her recovery from the divorce. My mother called every day for a week, each conversation following the same pattern. She'd start by asking if I was okay, then gradually work toward suggesting that maybe there was still some way to modify the trust arrangement. When I explained repeatedly that the legal commitment was final, she'd shift to talking about family healing and forgiveness. My aunt's approach was more direct. She left voicemails describing exactly how she felt about my decision, using language that would have made Grandpa reach for his belt. She seemed to believe that if she expressed enough outrage, I'd somehow undo months of legal paperwork and planning. The most interesting call came from my sister's ex-husband. He'd apparently heard about the situation and wanted to thank me for not enabling what he called her crisis addiction. He explained that throughout their marriage, every financial disaster had been met with family bailouts, and he'd watched her learn that dramatic emergencies could solve themselves if she waited long enough for relatives to step in. His perspective added a dimension I hadn't fully considered. Maybe my decision wasn't just about protecting my own agency in the family dynamic. Maybe it was about forcing my sister to develop the financial resilience she'd never needed to build. Update 2. 2 months later, my sister called with a different tone entirely. She'd spent the weeks after the brunch exploring options that had always existed but seemed impossible when a family bailout felt imminent. She'd negotiated payment plans with creditors, taken on freelance work in her field, and discovered that her financial situation, while serious, wasn't actually the life-ending catastrophe everyone had assumed. The conversation was awkward but genuine. She admitted that the inheritance plan had felt like a magical solution that would let her avoid dealing with the underlying problems that had created the debt in the first place. Without that escape route, she'd been forced to examine spending patterns and financial habits that had contributed to her situation. She didn't apologize for expecting the family to help, but she acknowledged that she'd never asked what I might want to do with my inheritance. The assumption that I'd be fine with their plan had been exactly that, an assumption based on surface-level observations about my lifestyle and priorities. Most importantly, she'd started talking to her kids about money and financial responsibility in ways she never had before. The crisis that had seemed catastrophic was becoming a learning experience that might prevent bigger problems down the road. My aunt, predictably, remained convinced that I'd damaged the family irreparably over money. But my parents had started asking different questions about how financial decisions got made in our extended family, and whether the tradition of bailing out whoever had the most dramatic crisis was actually helping anyone long-term. Update 3. 6 months after that Sunday brunch, I attended the first scholarship award ceremony for the fund I'd established. 5 students from my old neighborhood received awards that would cover their first year of college expenses, with the possibility of renewal based on academic performance. One recipient was a girl whose single mother worked 2 jobs to keep their family housed. Another was a boy who'd been working part-time since he was 14 to help with family expenses. These were kids who had talent and drive, but no safety net, no family inheritance to fall back on, no relatives who could write checks when things got difficult. Watching them accept their awards, I thought about Grandpa and the values he'd tried to teach me. Personal responsibility mattered, but so did recognizing when people needed genuine help rather than enabling dependency. The scholarship recipients had earned their opportunities through effort and perseverance, not through family drama and emotional manipulation. My sister attended the ceremony, bringing her kids to see what their uncle's inheritance had become. The awkwardness was still there, but so was understanding. Her financial situation had stabilized through her own efforts, and she developed skills and confidence that no family bailout could have provided. The ceremony reminded everyone present that the money hadn't disappeared or been wasted out of spite. It had been invested in futures, in possibilities, in young people who would use their education to build better lives for themselves and their families. My aunt didn't attend, but my parents did. They seemed to understand, finally, that my decision hadn't been about punishing my sister or rejecting family loyalty. It had been about choosing a different definition of what family money could accomplish and insisting that my voice mattered in that choice. The scholarship fund will continue awarding money long after the family drama fades. Every year, more students will get opportunities they wouldn't have had otherwise. And every year, I'll remember that Sunday brunch when my family assumed they could decide what mattered most with my inheritance, and how sometimes the most important stand you can take is the quiet one that redirects the conversation entirely.